Hi, welcome back to the committee program. I'm Arun Chaudhary. And what you just witnessed is perhaps one of my favorite pieces of political media of all time. It's, of course, Senator Mike Gravel's 2008 campaign announcement, throwing a rock into the water, allowing the ripples to go across, but more importantly, leaving space to look and stare. It harkens back to the kind of idea of what films could have been before they were just commercialized. It used to be that being uncomfortable and looking was an important part of cinema. And actually, when I first saw this, was in the Obama campaign, and I was like, this guy gets it. This guy knows what he's doing. And to someone like me, Senator Mike Gravel, who was passed away this week at 91 and is just an incredible force on the progressive left, and was then the senator from Alaska who famously read the Pentagon Papers into the permanent record when they couldn't be published. But that's all I knew about him. I hadn't known any of the things he had done since, and I hadn't known really any of the kind of anti-imperialism, anti-colonial stances that he was just bravely taking with anyone who would listen in the U.S. I just knew the Pentagon Papers until this rock came in, and then until we were all watching the first presidential debate in 2008 when Gravel just burst onto the scene and gave an amazing dressing down to all of the candidates, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, who I was working for then. And everyone was like, who the hell is this guy? And I was like, this is the guy. It's, it all came together. It's like, the Pentagon Papers and the rock video and like and so became, ever since then, I just became an incredible fan of this man and his work and how humbly he would talk to any group. We had been on a couple of panels together, the New York Young Communist League, for instance. Like there was no group of people who wanted to talk to Mike Gravel that he did not have the time to tell them and let them benefit from his experience and from his wisdom. And I think we're all used to seeing this sort of older Gravel. And I thought it would be nice, especially for a show like us who delves into old public domain films, to look at a documentary of Mike Gravel as a young man. I think of him here as sort of a sewer socialist as he traverses around Alaska, talking to natives, talking to regular folks, talking about oil pipelines and what can be done. I mean, it's Alaska. And so it's interesting to see, someone who was and has become an incredible champion of combating the climate emergency have a background in fossil fuel. I think that that's okay. And it just shows us that people who are willing to change their minds are the fuel by which progress happens, not people who are willing to make up excuses about why changing what they think that they know is wrong is hard. That's the bottom line. Gravel did not do it the easy way. Mike Gravel is an incorruptible force of nature who we should all look up to, emulate, and exalt. And we're all going to miss him so much. Special love sent from everyone here at the show to his family, his friends, and his chosen family at the Gravel Institute, who, again, are people who gave us a committee, at least, an opportunity to work with the Gravel campaign and to be reintroduced to this amazing thing. That is Henry, that's David, that's Kate, that's a lot of people. So I don't want to start to naming before the names escape me. So let's please watch this, remember, and think about Senator Mike Gravel.
The following documentary on that Senate race is presented to you by Alaskans for Mike Gravel. The prospector walks forward in bronze near where the ferry docks at Sitka, where men first turned their hopes and faces northward when Alaska changed hands there over 100 years ago. They set out after furs and fish and gold, building the towns and cities and finally the 49th American state. The job of building has been called still the #1 public issue in Alaska, asking each generation for new energy and a fresh start.
The state of Alaska has produced great riches for the entire United States. The gold rush era, I think, has to be done today, is as this wealth is being taken from the ground and taken from our seas, that efforts have to be made to see that this wealth is used to benefit people and people who are here in Alaska today. Man has come in, taken something, and left some old tires. And I think that we people in Alaska deserve more than that. I think the value should fall to people. And I think if we can leave a legacy that this wealth is to be used for the benefit of people and people here in Alaska, I think we'll be on a more imaginative and a sounder program.
From the old gold fields around Fairbanks south to Juneau, from Skagway to Barrow, Seward to Tanana, Mike Gravel has listened to the questions and tried to supply some answers as he sees them. Down in the Cook Inlet, for instance, deep beneath the seascape, the wealth may eventually exceed the great strikes in the Tanana Valley. But just as the ebb and flow of the tides of Cook Inlet are among the world's highest, the wealth of Alaska has been a story of steep rises followed by steep declines. Boom followed by ghost town followed by unemployed people. How can the wealth of what is potentially the richest of all states be shared in by all the people of that state?
Here we need a massive assault, an educational assault. Take this rig, for instance. If the company involved would train, say, 6 people for 6 months and let the government take up the cost of this training, but with the guarantee that at the end of 6 months, these people will have a job. All of the exploration that's going on in the interior of Alaska for oil, there's a tremendous possibility of hiring a great deal of our local Alaskans in these jobs, providing they can be trained, and I think they can be trained.
Kenai to Sitka. There was a time when Bristol Bay and the fishing industry paid the taxes in Alaska. Is the industry now a story of first-rate fishermen with fourth-rate equipment and facilities? What can be done about it?
Well, the individual fisherman's a small contractor. And the unfortunate thing is, like a lot of small business, he doesn't have the financial resources or the financial backup to undertake large endeavors. If we made a fraction of the effort in fisheries that we've made in farming, we'd see untold results. And of course, the scientists tell us that the food of the future is going to come from the sea and not from the land.
Bristol Bay to Kotzebue, Bethel to Nome. What can be done for Alaska's native poor, nearly 1/4 of the people of the state?
The burden of the urban areas is unusually high, and our task is to equalize this load by permitting all of the areas to contribute. Now, how we do that in rural Alaska is by raising the standard of living in rural Alaska, creating the necessary jobs and the opportunities so that people can make a decent living and buy housing and educate their children and pay their taxes. To say that that little girl there or that little girl there or this little girl here made a choice on being poor or made a choice on whether or not they live in Nome or whether they live in Alukkanuk or Tuntatuliak, I think begs the question to the point of being ridiculous. Anybody who says it can't be done really doesn't have the will or shouldn't be living in Alaska. I think the spirit of Alaska has been that it can be done and that it will be done. The situations aren't hopeless. It's just people get hopeless about the situation. And I think that there's no reason for hopelessness in Alaska. That when you see so many smiling faces, this is our future, huh?
Nome to Fairbanks. To student and faculty, the deepest question of the 1960s focuses on the far Pacific.
In Vietnam, like any war, is probably the most insane act of man. We've had many insane acts in the past, and I think we're arriving at a little more sanity. The question is, how do we go at it? How do you get peace? We may be there in Vietnam through historical error. We may be there because we're making an error. We could even be there through false idealism. But I feel quite strongly that we're not there because we're aggressors.
Home to Anchorage, to a home he designed himself and much of which he built.
Sure. You're going to hang up your coat real quick.
Mike Gravel is still barely on the sunshine side of 40, and like many other people in Alaska, he has come a long way from his birthplace in the lower 48. Since May of this year, his days at home are perhaps 1 out of 7. He has learned to write speeches on an airplane. His wife, Rita, has learned to expect him when he arrives. His young son and daughter have learned that there is a thing going called a campaign, and that Alaska is a big state for campaigns to cover. The decision Mike Gravel made last May was to speak his mind on what has been called one of the most perplexing decades in human history. About the time his first book came from the printers, he called a press conference. He wrote an announcement that itself was an answer to a question reporters had been asking him for 2 years. Actually, he had made his decision many years before.
For many months, there's been speculation I might seek public office this year. Today, I wish to put an end to the speculation and announce that I'm a candidate on the Democratic Party for the United States Senate. Every candidate for high office comes to a moment of truth when he must choose between sentiment and reality, between the easy path of getting along and going along, and the more difficult route of standing straight and saying he feels there's something to be said and something to be done.
For Mike Gravel, the road to public office started on Chestnut Street in Springfield, Massachusetts. When he became a builder years later, he was following the example of his father, who bucked the hard times of the 1930s as a small painting contractor. A family business that finally closed down as factories began shutting their doors in New England. But they were years when the sting of being broke was easier, because usually it was shared with the other families up and down the same block. Theirs was near an old area called Hungry Hill. Here, politics was an entertainment everyone could afford, and Mike's first job was passing out political handbills. His first try for office, a race for class president in high school, where he won a close race.
What the flag and the Constitution stand for.
Most of all, politics was a voice on the radio that managed to state a lasting point of view for the young men of the time. And even today, it has the sound of the present as well as the past.
And omission of a government frozen.
When FDR came to town, the hungry hills of America turned out. To the young men of the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was what the idea of political leadership was all about.
To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny.
Mike had a stay at nearby American International College. There was the usual 20th century interruption. He had started out as a private until the Army found out he had learned fluent French from his parents. Then it was OCS, Paris, Hamburg, Berlin. In the years when the nation began to sense that its responsibilities extended all the way east to the Brandenburg Gate. He was among those for whom the Cold War was the people who lived it, who desperately wanted out, for whom the line between East and West was a tangible fence that ran the length of a continent. He saw the fence and the people firsthand. He wore the plain clothes and heavy shades of an undercover agent, grew mustaches of various sizes. He once walked the streets of Stuttgart with $25,000 cash American for transferring to the underground apparatus. If he looked like an American edition of James Bond, the jokes would come years afterward. The hard line between East and West left a different kind of memory that shapes the opinions he expresses today.
I personally see no difference between spending American dollars to defend West Berlin with an airlift as opposed to spending those same dollars in South Vietnam. And I see no difference that if East Berlin invaded West Berlin, and mind you, that country was partitioned after the Second World War, just like North and South Vietnam were partitioned. And they may not like the partitioning, nor do the Germans like the partitioning. What would be the American reaction? What would be the thought of the liberals then? I think they'd gladly go to the defense of West Germany. And I think we should apply the same rule to Asians.
Berlin to New York. After 2 years in Europe, Mike Gravel rode the elevators for a while as runner for a Wall Street brokerage house. This helped pay tuition and expenses for Columbia University, with some classes in the daytime and some at night. Thoughts of a career in public service had stirred in him since boyhood. Thus, his degree was in economics and business. It qualified him for his first job after college, a position, as they used to say, in New York's transportation industry. The time was the early 1950s and jobs became scarce. Months before, a brother had written Mike from Anchorage, "This is the place." Now, driver number 53624 saved his fares with a purpose in view. He had a shelf of books on Alaska and knew people had found their way there by pack mule and longboat. He would make it by taxi cab, or at least from the fares the cab earned in a long, hot summer. New York to Anchorage, driving his brother's car. From Seattle on, his capital went for gas. Food was a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. He slept in the car. It was the classic Alaska story of arriving broke but confident. Sue Booch of Anchorage, who once was president of the Alaska Federation of Business and Professional Women, met him as he hunted for his first job.
The second day he arrived, he decided he wanted to sell real estate. I think perhaps he had it in his mind before he came. He said he had always had a yen to come to Alaska to see what we had to offer. So I worked with him, talked to him a little while, and I wrote his first real estate bond, real estate salesman's bond. And I had an opportunity to observe him pretty closely. And it was impressive to me to see somebody that was so interested in what we had to offer and the challenges that they presented themselves to a younger man. And these are the things I think that appealed to Mike.
Within a year or two, Mike would learn that he possessed what is sometimes called the gift of being able to make things happen. He sold a house his first week, then another. Then he found out the hard way that jobs in Alaska can dry up during the winter. He got a job as a brakeman on the run between Anchorage and Fairbanks. Work with his hands. He'd had plenty of experience with that.
On and off moving trains and flat cars, working with bunny boots and a big heavy parka, big mittens, and 20 below, sometimes 40 below, braking in the Fairbanks yard. I was doing general braking work and then signed on for the snow fleet, which traveled between Anchorage and Fairbanks to keep the track open.
Afterwards, back to selling, then organizing his own business, then active in public affairs. Things happened fast, a characteristic of Mike Gravel and of his state. By the time statehood arrived, he had made up his mind which way he wanted to travel, where to, and with whom. She had been Anchorage Fur Rendezvous Queen, and Mike had served as her official escort. In one of the big moments of statehood, she was assigned the job of pinning on the new star.
I was working at City Hall at the time, and the gentleman called and said, would you like to pin the 49th star on the flag? And I said, oh, what an honor, I'd love to, thinking nothing of how I was going to get to the top floor of the building. So they had a fire truck, and as I recall, one of the firemen pushed me up the ladder.
A few friends knew she had a lifelong fear of high places.
I know there were people on the roof and there were people out the windows, and it was an honor. And after I got up there, I thought, oh, what a horrible omen if I dropped the star. So I didn't know whether I was more worried about dropping the star or falling off myself. But we got through it, and it was a thrill of a lifetime. It was a great day. Statehood was a day that was just something that no one will ever forget, with the firecrackers and the hubbub and the bonfires and just general merrymaking. It was a tremendous day.
They were good days for Mike Gravel for several years. He could make things happen in business and public affairs. The National J.C. started a program to alert the nation to the need for tax reform. They selected Mike to be their Paul Revere and carry their message throughout the lower 48. In a few years, he had traveled a long way. A marriage, a home in Anchorage, the beginnings of business and personal success. Then, just as suddenly, the current ran the other way, and this, too, has been called part of the classic Alaska pattern. He had designed what was to be one of the state's largest communities of mobile homes, but with one mistake. It was underfinanced, and he could go bankrupt or stick it out.
Just spun it off and let the corporation go bankrupt. But it just didn't seem right to me, with all of the creditors involved, and there was about 60 of them, to just walk away from a deal after you sort of talked them all into going into it.
One of his many creditors was John Malarker.
I'd become involved in the court as we had furnished some material for Mike in this development, and so I came out here to see Mike, and I searched the court over it. I found two fellas standing on the bank. So I walked over to see if they knew where Mike was, and I looked down in the hole, and here Mike was in the hole up to his hips in ice-cold water, digging around trying to find a valve that somehow had gotten buried in the mud and so forth. And he was digging around down there, and I stood there and watched him, and it was very cold, and he was just mud all over. And I thought, well, by gosh, this man owes me some money, but he's at least trying, and he's trying to get this thing on its feet. So I thought, well, heck, if he's trying that hard, I'll just go along with him, which we did, and proved out to be a good move.
Well, he'd go out in the cold in the middle of the winter and crawl into the trailers where the moisture on your face would freeze the icicles to get the pipes thawed out and things like that. It was different.
Anchorage to Kenai, where the wealth may eventually exceed the great strikes in the Tanana Valley or Rabbit Creek. Here, Mike was an Alaska builder who anticipated events. As new families commenced arriving on the peninsula, he built the homes for them and had them ready. Here, the experience of the hard years when he was a newcomer started to pay off. He was a builder who laid out his own site plan, made up his own cost analyses, projected figures for traffic and population. In the business of building and development, he became one of the state's experts with a bright future. But he still had other ideas that needed a try.
Okay, thank you, Rudy. Good.
30 years before, he had an idea of someday making a career of public service. He thought politics and talked politics. It was more important than business success. By now, Mike Gravel had been a president of the Anchorage Tuberculosis Association, served on the National Committee for the Support of the Public Schools. He made a race for the State House of Representatives in 1958 and lost by a country mile. He tried again in 1962 and was a winner. He discovered he not only had the gift for making things happen, but over the years he had developed a natural talent for persuasion. Bruce Kendall was a Republican Speaker of the House when Mike showed up as a youthful member of the legislature.
His overriding effectiveness is the fact that he's always better prepared than anyone else on any given subject. It was very hard to ever badger him into a corner because he had the subject well researched. When you took Mike on the floor of the House, you had a well-versed, well-oriented, and well-researched adversary. I would say that Mr. Gravel introduced more legislation and on varied subjects and well-thought-out bills than any legislator that I had ever served with.
Anchorage to Juneau. After serving one term, Mike Gravel was elected Speaker of the House by his colleagues. It was the 4th Alaska legislature. It would be called the most productive in the state's short history. It passed a water code and an insurance code. It initiated bonding programs for airports, highways, the university. It improved teacher salaries, and newspapers commented that it did more for education than the previous 3 sessions of the legislature combined. He took his legislative council out into the 4 corners. He established listening sessions to let the legislators see the needs firsthand. He was himself the kind of legislator who formed strong opinions.
I think our first Alaskans have been cheated. I think they haven't received a fair deal, for whatever reason there may be. And some are candid, some are real, some are valuable, some are valueless, some are bigoted. For whatever reason, they haven't received a fair shake. These people have to regain their birthright. I think one of the ways that they're going to do it, and I say they're going to do it, because you can truly never give anything to people, they will earn it. I think the native people will do it through their land claims. And I can't think of anything that's going to happen to the state of Alaska which has greater value to not only for the natives, but for all Alaskans. And that's the just payment to a maximum amount and the just distribution of a goodly portion of land to the natives of our total state of Alaska.
An American political campaign for a major office has been described as 1 part carnival, another part earnest debate, a 3rd part daily exhaustion. In 1968, Mike Gravel admittedly was a man making an uphill fight. But wherever people gathered, he had promised to show up to talk his program, and usually he managed.
Let's win!
He found time to publish a book about Alaska with the title Jobs and More Jobs. This, he said, was what the campaign was all about, to provide a program of employment for a state where underemployment was traditional.
They ain't popping them contracts till late in the fall, you know, in the middle of the season. Especially your Army contracts, they ain't coming out.
There's few, but like I said, it's...
To work for a check on prices that historically had skyrocketed year after year.
Summer, I'm intending to do a little fishing myself.
You're here at the Pioneer Home?
Yes, I've been here for about 7 years.
How do you like it?
Nobody talks my language. I have to get out. If you don't blow off steam, I know a lot of people used to work on the...
He found a slogan. Let's do something about the state we're in.
Whereabouts you from? Up Anchorage area then?
Huh?
Whereabouts are you from in Alaska?
Well, from Seward.
Seward. Then you work for the railroad, huh?
Yes, I worked here. I was there 6 years before the government railroad. We had a railroad there, but when in 15 was Anchorage town, 10th town. But we had the Iditarod mail. See, the boat could pay the indemnity on the mail and all about one boat a month.
How do you like it down here?
Oh, it's all right here for an old man. Good place.
Yeah. You're looking good, though.
Well,
In Sitka, Alaska changed hands over 100 years ago. Yet the job of building is still called the #1 public issue. A job that asks each generation for new energy and a fresh start.
Running for the United States Senate, and I need the votes this year.
Okay.
You can't do any more harm than the rest of them.
Well, the problem is I'll try and do some good. Did you get a surveying job after? Are they going to get you a job?
I'm putting up.
Does it look like you'll get one?
Mike Gravel's slogan was, let's do something about the state we're in. It meant, he said, that as a United States Senator, he aimed to pay attention to the problems of Alaska. It was a goal that was worth an uphill fight.
The honor that I'm seeking to represent the people here in Alaska would be one of the most cherished things that I could ever hope to acquire. And it would be a great adventure to put forth all of the effort and ability that I might have to return that honor by trying to make a contribution that will last beyond my immediate lifetime.
The proceeding was presented to you by Alaskans for Mike Gravel.